Horror story. The day began with a rare sense of wonder and excitement as our group gathered at the base of the mountain. We were a mixed bunch, young thrill-seekers, seasoned hikers, and a few retirees looking for one last taste of adventure. But we all shared a single goal: to conquer the heights together. The mountain loomed high above us, its peaks veiled in mist, the rocks sharp and silent beneath the gray dawn light. For some, it was a pilgrimage; for others, a simple escape from the noise of the world below. Yet none of us could have guessed the sinister reality that awaited us. The ascent started well enough. The higher we climbed, the deeper the sense of isolation grew. The pine trees thinned, and the air became colder and sharper, biting our faces and pricking at our skin. I remember catching glimpses of hawks circling high above, gliding effortlessly through the thin air, and thinking how lucky they were to live in a place so remote and untouched. The mountain felt alive in a way that cities never did. Up here, every sound echoed in the silence, and every whisper of wind seemed to carry secrets of the ancient land. We had an experienced guide leading us, a man named Ezra. He was in his early 60s, but he moved like a man half his age. Weather-beaten and silent, he exuded a calm that put us all at ease. It was clear he had trekked these paths more times than he could count. Ezra had lived in these mountains all his life and had an almost reverential respect for them. He walked at the front, his weathered boots grinding softly against the gravelly trail, his steady breath syncing with the natural rhythms around us. As we trekked higher, Ezra shared snippets of local folklore with us. He told stories of lost miners, old rituals, and strange lights seen above the peaks at night. His words made us feel like we were entering a world older and wilder than anything we'd ever known. Yet, with every story he offered a warning, a reminder of the respect demanded by the mountain. "This place has eyes," he murmured, barely audible over the soft crunch of our footsteps. "It's always watching. Don't take it lightly." We reached a small plateau by mid-afternoon, the sky now turning a steely gray as clouds gathered above us. Here, Ezra paused to let us rest and take in the view. The valley sprawled below, thick with trees and shrouded in mist. The world felt hushed, as if even the mountain held its breath. We passed around water bottles and granola bars, laughing and exchanging stories, feeling a bond strengthened by the heights we'd reached together. But our peace was soon interrupted by a strange, faint sound. It started as a distant rumble, a vibration that we could almost feel more than hear. It rolled through the mountainside, subtle at first, but growing in intensity until it felt like it was all around us. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. We glanced around, confusion etched across our faces, our gazes searching the vast, mist-cloaked landscape for the source of the sound. The mountains had been eerily silent all day, and now, as if in response to our intrusion, they seemed to be speaking back. "What was that?" someone whispered, their voice taut with anxiety. Ezra's face turned grave as he listened intently, his brow furrowed. He seemed to weigh his words before responding, his voice low and measured. "Probably just an avalanche somewhere in the distance," he said, though his tone betrayed a hint of doubt. "Sound carries strangely up here." But even as he said it, I could see the unease flicker in his eyes. Something about that rumbling seemed too deliberate, too calculated. The sound died down, leaving us in an even heavier silence. It was as though the mountain itself was waiting, watching our every move, judging our presence. We pushed on, though the cheerful mood of our group had been dampened. The air seemed colder and the mist grew thicker, swirling around us like ghostly fingers. Shadows lengthened as the daylight began to fade, and with each step, a strange tension gripped us. The trail narrowed and the cliffside dropped steeply to our right. I felt my heart pound with each precarious step, the wind howling like a distant scream through the valleys below. And then, suddenly, it happened. The rumbling returned, louder and closer this time, shaking the ground beneath our feet. We stopped in our tracks, hearts racing, eyes wide with fear. But this time there was something else mixed in with the sound, a voice, faint but unmistakable. A single word, echoing through the mountains. "Help." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill racing down my spine. The word seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the mist like some phantom plea. We exchanged nervous glances, our minds scrambling to make sense of what we'd just heard. Was it a trick of the wind? A hiker in distress? Ezra's face went pale, his usually steady gaze clouded with something darker, something like dread. "Stay together," he ordered quietly, his voice suddenly sharp. "And whatever you do, don't wander off." We huddled closer, clinging to one another for reassurance as the shadows deepened around us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt amplified, setting our nerves on edge. And then, as if on cue, the voice returned, clearer this time and closer. Help. The sound twisted through the trees, haunting and sorrowful, lingering like a half-remembered nightmare. But there was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The voice didn't sound quite human. It was as though someone were imitating the word, repeating it with an eerie, mechanical precision. What is that?" someone whispered, their voice quivering. Ezra looked over his shoulder, his gaze intense. "That's not a voice you want to follow," he said, his tone deadly serious. "This mountain holds things older than us, things that have learned how to mimic, how to lure the living. They know how to make us believe we're not alone." "What are you talking about?" another hiker asked, a tremor in his voice. Ezra took a long, slow breath, his eyes scanning the mist. "There are stories, old stories, of creatures that live in the shadows. Shapeshifters. Beings that can steal your face, your voice. They lure you in, call to you with voices of the ones you love. But if you follow, you'll never return." A heavy silence settled over us as his words sank in. We were standing on the edge of something ancient and dark, a world we didn't understand and certainly didn't belong in. And then, from the depths of the mist, we heard it again. This time, the word came even closer, almost directly in front of us. Help. It was the same voice, but louder, more desperate, echoing through the trees with an uncanny realism that turned our blood to ice. Ezra's hand shot up, signaling us to stop. We stood frozen, hearts pounding as the sound enveloped us. The voice was close, so close that it felt like it was right in front of us, lurking just beyond the edge of the path, waiting. We peered into the darkness ahead, but all we could see was a swirling wall of mist, thick and impenetrable. There was no sign of anyone, no flicker of movement, just the chilling, echoing cry for help, resonating in the depths of the shadows. And for the first time, I realized with a sickening dread that whatever was calling to us wasn't asking for help. It was trying to draw us in. The silence hung thick around us, each second stretching into a painful eternity as we stood, caught between curiosity and terror. That voice, haunting and unnatural, still echoed in our ears, an eerie plea for help. It felt as though the mountain itself was testing us, seeing who among us would break. Just as the dread began to feel unbearable, one of the tourists, a young man named Marcus, finally spoke up, his voice quivering but laced with a strange determination. I have a drone with a thermal imager," he stammered, looking at us with wide, anxious eyes. "It's in my pack. If there's someone out there, this thing can find them. We'll know for sure where the voice is coming from." A murmur of relief swept through the group. It seemed absurd to rely on technology for safety in a place so ancient and wild, yet the thought of having some form of insight into the darkness around us felt like a lifeline. Ezra glanced at Marcus, his expression torn between skepticism and a faint glimmer of hope. After a brief pause, he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "But be careful. Keep it close, and whatever you do, don't go after it alone." Marcus nodded, fumbling with his pack to retrieve the drone, his hands shaking slightly. He was a tech enthusiast, the kind who always brought extra gadgets on trips, though he'd never expected this one to be anything but a fun way to capture scenic shots. Within moments, he had the drone out, sleek and black, and it buzzed softly as he set it up for flight. The rest of us crowded around him, our eyes glued to the small screen on his controller. The soft whir of the rotors broke the silence as the drone lifted into the air, its tiny red lights blinking against the growing dusk. Marcus piloted it carefully, letting it rise above the treeline, hovering for a moment before he angled it forward and directed it toward the source of the sound. Through the thermal imager, the landscape appeared in eerie shades of black, gray and white, the rocks and trees blending into an otherworldly tableau. We held our breath, our eyes locked on the screen, watching as the drone glided over the terrain, scanning for anything that would reveal the source of that disturbing voice. Marcus zoomed in on the rocky outcroppings, his hands tightening on the controls as he directed the drone deeper into the mist. And then, abruptly, something appeared on the screen, a faint, distorted blur of heat about 300 yards away. It was small at first, almost indistinguishable from the shadows around it. But as Marcus adjusted the focus, the outline became clearer. My stomach lurched as the shape took form, growing more defined, yet disturbingly wrong. It was hunched, its limbs elongated and twisted at impossible angles, a grotesque parody of an animal. What is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely a tremor. The creature moved in jerky, unnatural strides, its legs contorted, its back arched at an angle that defied all reason. But what sent a cold wave of fear through us was the way it moved toward the drone. No, toward us. It was coming straight for us, with an uncanny intent, and as if to confirm our worst fears, the thing stopped, raised its head and opened its mouth. A high, grating sound poured out of it, echoing in our direction. "Help!" It called again, the word twisted, distorted as if dragged through gravel. It was an imitation, a mockery, a sound that was never meant to come from a living being. Every syllable was wrong, each note laced with a primal malice that sent a chill down my spine. Marcus swore, his hands shaking as he jerked the drone backward, trying to put more distance between us and that thing. But the creature picked up speed, its gait shifting from a walk to a grotesque, loping run, its limbs moving in ways no animal should move. The heat signature grew larger as it closed the gap, its outline writhing and distorting in ways that defied understanding. It didn't just move, it seemed to ripple, its shape fluctuating like liquid, shifting and reforming as it drew nearer. "Get back." Ezra's voice cut through our paralysis, and suddenly reality snapped back. Without a second thought, we turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the rocky ground as we raced away from the horror that pursued us. I was near the front, running alongside Marcus, who clutched the drone controller tightly, his gaze darting from the screen to the path in front of us. The drone kept its position, hovering just ahead, capturing everything in dreadful detail. Behind us, the others were sprinting, their breaths ragged and panicked. The air was thick with fear, and in that terrifying silence, all we could hear was the slap of our feet against the earth and the monstrous growl that was growing louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder and my heart nearly stopped. The creature had halved the distance, now only about 100 yards away, its eyes, small, beady and glowing faintly in the infrared, locked onto us with a hunger that was beyond animalistic. Every instinct screamed for us to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. But no matter how fast we moved, it seemed faster, closing the distance with terrifying ease. Its distorted, unnatural limbs clawed at the ground, its mouth stretching wide as it let out a guttural, inhuman roar, a sound that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. It was a sound of hunger, a sound of death. "Faster!" I shouted, my voice barely rising above the drone's whir and the pounding of my own heart. My legs burned, every muscle screaming, but I pushed harder, my breaths coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Beside me, Marcus struggled to keep pace, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. The trail veered to the right, and Marcus and I instinctively darted down it, hoping to throw the creature off our scent. The others followed, but the thing was relentless, its twisted body lunging forward as it pursued us with an unnatural, terrifying speed. We could feel it gaining, feel the heat of its presence pressing against us like a dark wave. Suddenly, Marcus stumbled, almost losing his grip on the controller. I grabbed his arm, steadying him, and together we surged forward, our minds blank with panic. As we rounded a bend, a terrible guttural growl split the air, a sound so low and primal that it shook the ground beneath our feet. I felt the vibrations echo through my bones, a deep, resonant fear that rooted itself deep in my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, we spotted a small outcrop, a rock formation that jutted out over a narrow ledge. With no other choice, Marcus and I threw ourselves toward it, scrambling up the rocks, our hands scraping against the rough stone. Behind us, the creature paused as if confused by the sudden change in direction. It let out another terrifying growl, its distorted form rippling with barely contained rage. Breathing hard, I looked over at Marcus, who clutched his controller, his hands trembling. The drone still hovered in the air, capturing the creature as it prowled below us, pacing back and forth, its eyes fixed on our hiding place. We watched in horrified silence as it sniffed the air, its twisted limbs shifting and twitching, as if it were straining to maintain its grotesque form. And then, as if sensing that it had lost our trail, it let out a final, blood-curdling screech and slinked back into the darkness, its form melting into the shadows like smoke. The silence that followed was overwhelming, heavy and absolute. Marcus lowered the drone, his eyes haunted as he stared at the screen. Neither of us dared speak, our bodies trembling, our minds barely processing what we just escaped. We clambered down from the rocks, joining the others who looked as shaken as we felt. The relief was palpable, though tinged with a fear that none of us could shake. Marcus held the controller in his hands and we all stared at the screen, where the last few moments of footage were frozen. A distorted, unnatural face staring back at us, its mouth stretched in a hideous grin, its eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. Do we watch it?" one of the tourists asked, their voice barely a whisper. Marcus swallowed hard, his face pale. He looked at each of us, then shook his head slowly. "Not here," he murmured, his voice hollow. "Not now." We knew we had captured something unspeakable, something that defied all logic, something that no one would believe without seeing. Yet, as we stood there, staring at that frozen, monstrous face on the screen, none of us wanted to relive those terrible moments. That face, that twisted, hungry face, was something that would haunt our nightmares forever.